The white rose fell from Helen's trembling fingers as she heard his voice behind her at the charity gala. For 2 years, someone had been leaving white roses at the cafe where she worked, always on Tuesday mornings, always with no note, always making her heart race with the mystery of who cared enough to remember her. Tonight, wearing a borrowed emerald gown that transformed her from waitress to enchantress, she had finally planned to forget about mysterious admirers and steel-grey eyes that haunted her dreams. "Tell me he's not yours." Matthias Romano's voice was raw with desperation as he stepped closer, his presence consuming all the oxygen in the ballroom. "Because I'm about to do something that will start a war." The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Around them, New York's elite continued their charity gala, unaware that the most dangerous man in the city was about to shatter his own carefully constructed world for a waitress who had unknowingly held his heart hostage for 2 years. What Helen didn't know was that the man standing behind her had been leaving those roses. What she couldn't see was that Matthias Romano had built his entire Tuesday routine around watching her smile. And what neither of them realized was that their love story had begun long before they ever met, with a tragedy that would either destroy them or forge them into something unbreakable. To follow this intense story of forbidden love and dangerous secrets, join our community. Our goal is to reach 5,000 subscribers, and your support makes all the difference. Subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Helen Martinez stood in her tiny apartment, staring at the collection of white roses pressed between the pages of an old cookbook, her most treasured possessions. 24 roses collected over 2 years, each one found waiting for her at the cafe on Tuesday mornings. Her best friend Sophia had insisted the mysterious admirer was probably some creepy old man, but Helen's heart knew better. There was something pure about those roses, something that spoke of protection rather than obsession. Tonight, wearing the emerald silk gown Sophia had practically forced her to borrow, she was finally going to stop dreaming about mysterious roses and unreachable men. The Romano Foundation Charity Gala was a $1,000 per plate event that supported children's hospitals, a world away from her life serving coffee to New York's power players. "You need this," Sophia had argued earlier that week. "You spend your days serving the same customers, watching them live lives you think you can't have. Tonight you get to be one of them." What Sophia didn't know, what no one knew, was that there was one customer who had made those 2 years both paradise and torture. Matthias Romano arrived every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 2 p.m., ordered black coffee with a splash of cream, the only modification he ever made to anything in his perfectly controlled life, and conducted meetings that made grown men sweat with fear. But it was the way he looked at her that kept Helen awake at night. Not like she was a servant, but like she was a puzzle he desperately wanted to solve. Sometimes she caught him staring at her with such intensity that her hands would shake as she poured his coffee. And twice, just twice, when she'd made a joke while taking his order, she'd seen him fight back what looked almost like a smile. Now, stepping out of the taxi with her brother Marcus beside her, Helen felt like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole. Marcus, in town from California for business, had agreed to escort her when Sophia fell ill. "Relax," Marcus said, offering his arm as they approached the Plaza Hotel. "You look incredible. Every man in there is going to want to know who you are." If only he knew that there was only one man whose attention she'd been craving for 2 years, and he was the last person who would ever see her as anything more than the girl who served his coffee. The ballroom was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers casting rainbow patterns across marble floors, walls draped in midnight blue silk, tables adorned with white roses that made her think of her mysterious Tuesday morning gifts. Helen felt her confidence wavering as she took in the sea of designer gowns and the easy confidence of people born to wealth. She was reaching for a champagne flute when she saw him. Matthias Romano stood near the orchestra, commanding attention without saying a word. His black tuxedo was perfectly tailored to his powerful 6'3" frame, his dark hair slightly tousled in a way that made her fingers itch to smooth it back. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. Those steel-grey depths that had haunted her dreams were scanning the crowd with predatory precision. Then they found her. Time stopped. The orchestra continued playing, guests continued chatting, but for Helen the world had narrowed to just those steel-grey eyes and the way they traveled slowly down her form. She watched his jaw clench, his hands ball into fists at his sides, and something that looked almost like pain flash across his features before Marcus stepped into her line of vision. "Earth to Helen," her brother laughed, following her gaze. "See someone you know?" "Just admiring the architecture," she managed, accepting the champagne with trembling fingers. But when she looked back, Matthias was gone, and she felt that familiar sensation of being watched by an invisible guardian. For the next hour, Helen tried to lose herself in the evening. She danced with Marcus, made polite conversation, even bid on a weekend spa retreat during the auction. But no matter where she moved, she could feel those steel-grey eyes following her every step. During the auction, she noticed something that made her heart skip. The featured item was funding for a new children's wing at St. Mary's Hospital, the same hospital where her father had died when she was 16. Without thinking, she raised her paddle. "50,000, called the auctioneer. 75, came a deep voice from across the room. Helen turned to see Matthias, his eyes locked on hers as he bid. She raised her paddle again. 100, 200, he countered immediately, never breaking eye contact. The entire ballroom was watching now, sensing the tension crackling between them like electricity. But Helen couldn't back down. This was for the children's wing, for her father's memory. 250, she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. Matthias was quiet for a long moment, his steel-grey eyes searching her face. Then, to her shock, he inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect, and sat down. "Sold to the beautiful lady in emerald," the auctioneer announced as applause thundered through the ballroom. Helen felt her knees go weak as the reality of what she'd done hit her. $250,000. Her entire life savings was maybe $5,000. She was going to have to explain to the charity that she couldn't actually pay, was going to humiliate herself in front of... "The bid has been covered," an auction assistant whispered in her ear. "An anonymous donor has ensured your pledge is fulfilled." She knew without being told who that anonymous donor was. It was near midnight when Marcus excused himself to take a business call, leaving her alone by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. She was trying to process the evening, the mysterious white roses at every table, the auction, the way Matthias had let her win, then paid for it himself, when she felt that familiar shift in the air. "Tell me he's not yours." His voice was raw with something that sounded like desperation. "Because I'm about to do something that will start a war." Helen turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs as she faced the man who had become her beautiful obsession. Up close, Matthias was devastating. His black tuxedo couldn't hide the dangerous power that radiated from him, and those steel-grey eyes held secrets that could destroy empires. "My brother," she said quietly, watching as relief flooded his features. "Marcus is visiting from California." The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders relaxed, his hands unclenched, and for just a moment she saw something vulnerable in those predatory eyes, something that looked almost like hope. "Why?" she asked, her newfound confidence surprising them both. "Why does it matter to you?" The question hung between them like a challenge. She saw the war playing out across his features, desire battling with control, need wrestling with something that looked almost like fear. "Because," he said quietly, stepping closer until she could smell his cologne and feel the heat radiating from his body. "I'd burn down every empire I've built just to keep you safe." The words hit her like lightning, raw and honest and completely devastating. "You don't even know me," she whispered. "I know you take your coffee with exactly 2 sugars and a splash of vanilla cream," he said, his voice dropping to that rough whisper that made her knees weak. "I know you always tip Maria, the cleaning lady, from your own pocket, even when the jar is already full. I know you've read every book on that shelf behind the counter, and you switch between Italian poetry and business journals like you're planning to conquer the world." The accuracy of his observations left her breathless. He had been watching her, really watching her, seeing details that even her closest friends missed. "You've been leaving the roses," she realized, pieces clicking into place. His jaw clenched. "You kept them." It wasn't a question. Somehow, he knew. "Every single one," she admitted. "They're the most beautiful thing in my apartment." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, wonder, and something that looked almost like pain. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly, then seemed to catch himself. "You should stay away from me, Helen. I'm not someone who gets to have beautiful things." "Why not?" "Because beautiful things get destroyed in my world. And you, He reached out as if to touch her face, then stopped himself, his hand falling back to his side. "You're too pure for what I am." "What if I don't want to be pure?" The words surprised them both. Before he could respond, a man in a dark suit appeared beside them. "Boss," the man said urgently, "we have a situation. The Torino family just hit 3 of our legitimate businesses. This wasn't random." The mask slipped back over Matthias's features, the vulnerable man replaced by the predator who controlled half of New York's underground. "How many casualties?" he asked, his voice sharp with authority. 2 dead, 5 injured. They left a message. Matthias's jaw tightened. "What kind of message?" The man glanced at Helen, clearly uncomfortable discussing business in front of a civilian. "It's about Isabella," the man said quietly. The name hit Matthias like a physical blow. Helen watched all the color drain from his face, watched his hands start to shake before he clenched them into fists. "Excuse me," he said to Helen, his voice formal and distant. But as he turned to leave, she heard him whisper, "Some ghosts never stay buried." And then he was gone, leaving her standing alone with questions burning in her mind and the taste of his name on her lips. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Helen danced, smiled, and made conversation, but part of her was always scanning the crowd for dark hair and steel-grey eyes. She caught glimpses of him across the room, always surrounded by men in expensive suits, always conducting business with an intensity that made her understand why people feared him. But every time their eyes met across the ballroom, she saw that vulnerability flickering beneath the surface. She was getting her coat from the coat check when she overheard 2 women talking. "Poor Matthias," one was saying. 20 years, and he still blames himself for what happened to Isabella. Well, he was supposed to protect her. She was only 16 when Lorenzo Martinez had her killed. Such a waste. She would have been beautiful, just like her mother. They say Matthias went completely dark after that, killed Martinez with his bare hands and never looked back. The conversation faded as the women moved away, but the words echoed in Helen's mind. Isabella, the name that had made Matthias look like he'd been shot. Someone he was supposed to protect, someone who died because he failed. And Lorenzo Martinez, a name that made her blood run cold, because it was her father's name. But that was impossible. Her father had died in a hospital when she was 16, succumbed to cancer after a long battle. He hadn't been killed by anyone, least of all the man she was falling in love with. She was still processing this information when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I need to see you again. Tomorrow 2 p.m. the cafe. There are things you need to know about who you are." The message made her heart race and her hands tremble. Things she needed to know about who she was. What could Matthias Romano possibly know about her that she didn't know herself? As Marcus drove her home through the empty streets of New York, Helen stared out at the city lights and wondered if falling in love always felt this much like jumping off a cliff. What she didn't know was that across town, Matthias was staring at a photograph of his sister Isabella, a picture taken just days before she died. And for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't seeing his failure reflected in those young features. He was seeing Helen's smile. Helen arrived at the cafe 30 minutes early, her heart racing as she prepared for whatever revelation Matthias planned to share. She'd barely slept, turning over the fragments of conversation she'd overheard about Isabella and Lorenzo Martinez, a name that couldn't possibly be connected to her father. At exactly 2 p.m., the door chimed, and Matthias entered alone. He looked different in daylight, older somehow, as if the weight of whatever he was carrying had aged him overnight. When their eyes met, she saw something that looked almost like grief in those steel-grey depths. "We need to talk somewhere private," he said quietly. "Not here. My apartment is upstairs," she offered, surprised by her own boldness. He hesitated. "Helen, what I'm about to tell you, it's going to change everything." "Good," she said firmly, "because I'm tired of living in questions." Her apartment was tiny but warm, filled with books and the pressed white roses she'd collected over 2 years. Matthias moved to the window overlooking the street, his powerful frame tense with whatever war was raging inside him. "Tell me about your father," he said without turning around. "He died when I was 16. Cancer," she replied, studying his profile. "Why? What was his full name?" "Lorenzo Miguel Martinez." The words felt heavy in the air between them. Matthias's shoulders sagged, and she watched his reflection close his eyes in the window glass. "He didn't die of cancer, Helen. The words hit her like a physical blow. What are you talking about? I was there. I watched him fade away in that hospital bed. He put a bullet in his own head rather than face what I was going to do to him. The room spun around her as the meaning of his words sank in. You're lying. I wish I was. He turned to face her, and she saw 20 years of guilt and pain carved into his features. Lorenzo Martinez killed my sister. She was 16, beautiful, innocent, everything good in my world. He had her murdered to send a message to my father. No, Helen whispered, shaking her head. My father wasn't a killer. He was gentle, kind. He was also one of the most dangerous men in New York, Matthias said quietly. Head of the Martinez family, my father's biggest rival. And when he realized I was coming for him, when he knew what I would do to him for taking Isabella from me, he chose to die on his own terms. The room was spinning now, everything she thought she knew about her life crumbling around her. You're saying my father killed your sister and you drove him to suicide? I'm saying I spent 20 years believing I had avenged Isabella's death. And then you walked into that cafe, and suddenly I couldn't breathe because you have her smile, her kindness, her way of seeing light in dark places. Oh, God, Helen whispered, sinking into a chair as the full magnitude of the situation hit her. You've been watching me because I remind you of her, the sister you lost because of my father. At first, yes, he admitted, but then I started watching you for who you are, not who you reminded me of. I watched you give your last $5 to that homeless veteran every Tuesday. I watched you stay late to help Maria with her English homework. I watched you and fell in love with your heart, your strength, your beautiful soul. But I'm his daughter, she said, her voice breaking. I'm the daughter of the man who destroyed your family. You're the daughter of a man who made terrible choices, Matthias corrected, crossing the room to kneel in front of her chair. But you are not his choices. You are not his sins. You are the most beautiful thing that's ever happened to me. How can you say that? Tears were streaming down her face now. How can you look at me and not see him? Because when I look at you, I see the woman who spent her entire life savings on a charity auction for sick children. I see the woman who learned Italian in secret because she heard me speaking it and wanted to understand. I see the woman who kept every rose I left because they made her feel special. Her heart stopped. You know about the Italian? Bambina mia, he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. Did you think I wouldn't notice when you started understanding everything I said? The endearment, my baby girl, spoken in the Italian she'd spent months learning, broke something inside her chest. I wanted to surprise you, she whispered. I wanted to be able to talk to you in your language. You've been talking to me in my language from the first day we met, he said, reaching up to touch her face. Kindness is universal, amore mio. But the past is done, he said firmly. Isabella is gone, your father is gone, and there's nothing either of us can do to change what happened 20 years ago. But we're here now, and I refuse to let their ghosts destroy the first real happiness I've felt since I was 18 years old. Your family will never accept me, she said, leaning into his touch despite everything. My family will accept whoever I choose to protect and love, and I choose you, Helen Martinez, not because of who your father was, but because of who you are. The kiss that followed was desperate. 20 years of grief and guilt and unexpected love poured into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. There's something else you need to know, he said, his forehead resting against hers. The Torino family knows about you now. They know you matter to me, which means they'll try to use you against me. Then we face it together, she said, surprising them both with her determination. Helen, you don't understand what you're saying. These people don't play games. They kill to make points. Then teach me to protect myself. Teach me to be part of your world instead of trying to shelter me from it. Before he could respond, his phone rang with that urgent tone she remembered from the yacht. His face went white as he answered. What do you mean she's gone? He barked into the phone. How is that possible with 4 men watching her? He listened for a moment, and Helen watched horror dawn across his features. They took Victoria, he said, ending the call. The Torino family has her, and they're demanding a meeting. Why would they take your fiancé, ex-fiancé? He corrected quickly. I ended the engagement this morning, which apparently was exactly what they were waiting for. Now they're using her as bait to draw me out. Then we go get her, Helen said simply. We? He stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Absolutely not. I'm putting you somewhere safe while I handle this. Matthias, she said firmly, standing to face him. I'm not running, I'm not hiding. If you love me the way you say you do, then trust me to stand beside you. I can't lose you, he said desperately. Not now. Not when I just found you. Then don't lose me, she replied, reaching for the gun she'd seen him checking earlier. Teach me how to help you win. Looking into her determined eyes, Matthias realized that Helen Martinez wasn't just the daughter of his enemy. She was about to become the most powerful ally he'd ever had. But first, they had to survive the night. The warehouse district was deserted except for a few scattered streetlights casting long shadows across empty loading docks. Matthias parked the armored SUV a block away from the meeting point, his jaw clenched as he ran through the plan one more time. You stay in the car with Alessandro, he said to Helen, checking his weapon. If anything goes wrong, he gets you out of here. And leave you to face them alone? Helen's voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes. I don't think so. This isn't negotiable, amore mio. The Torino family doesn't just kill, they make examples. And if they get their hands on you, they already have an innocent woman, Helen interrupted. Victoria might be cold and calculating, but she doesn't deserve to die because she was engaged to you. Matthias stared at her, struck once again by her capacity for compassion, even towards someone who had treated her dismissively at the cafe. You're remarkable, you know that, he said softly. I'm terrified, she admitted, but I'm more terrified of losing you than I am of facing them. Before he could respond, his earpiece crackled to life. Boss, came the voice of one of his men positioned around the warehouse. Movement on the south side. 3 vehicles, at least 12 men. Copy that, Matthias replied. He turned to Helen one last time. If I don't make it out, you'll make it out, she said firmly, surprising him by pulling him down for a fierce kiss. Because now you have something worth living for. The warehouse was exactly what Helen had expected. Concrete floors, high windows, and enough shadows to hide an army. But what she hadn't expected was to see Victoria Torino bound to a chair in the center of the space, very much alive, but clearly terrified. Matthias Romano, called a voice from the darkness. Still making dramatic entrances, I see. A man emerged from the shadows, mid-60s, expensive suit, silver hair, and eyes like chips of ice. Behind him came a dozen armed men, their weapons trained on Matthias. Anthony Torino, Matthias replied, his voice calm despite being outnumbered. Still hiding behind innocent women? Innocent? Anthony laughed. There's nothing innocent about the Romano family. You killed my son, you son of a bitch. Your son tried to rape a 14-year-old girl under my protection, Matthias replied coldly. I gave him a cleaner death than he deserved. He was my heir. He was a monster, just like his father. The tension in the warehouse ratcheted up another notch as both sides shifted, weapons readying. Enough, Anthony snarled. You want your precious fiancée back? Then you're going to trade her for something much more valuable. Name your price. Your life, Anthony said with obvious satisfaction. You put a bullet in your own head right here, right now, and the girl goes free. Matthias didn't hesitate. Done. No. The scream came from 2 sources, Victoria tied to her chair, and Helen, who had somehow slipped away from Alessandro and into the warehouse. Helen, get out of here, Matthias commanded, but she was already moving, positioning herself between him and Anthony's men. Do you want him? She called out, her voice carrying across the concrete space. Then you'll have to go through me first. Anthony's men shifted their weapons toward her, but she didn't flinch. Who the hell is this? Anthony demanded. Someone who's tired of men like you hurting people I care about, Helen replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Helen, please, Matthias said desperately. Just go. I told you, she said without taking her eyes off Anthony. I'm not running. Anthony's face split into a cruel smile. Well, well, the great Matthias Romano has found himself a little protector. How touching. Actually, Helen said, her voice taking on a tone that made Matthias's blood run cold, I think you'll find this situation is more complicated than you realized. She reached into her jacket and withdrew a small recording device. You see, Mr. Torino, I've been recording everything you've said since we walked in here. Kidnapping, extortion, conspiracy to commit murder, quite a collection of federal crimes. Anthony's smile faltered. You're bluffing. Am I? Helen pressed a button, and Anthony's voice filled the warehouse. You put a bullet in your own head, right here, right now. The FBI has been investigating your family for months, she continued, her voice gaining strength. All they needed was evidence, and you just gave it to them. You're lying, Anthony snarled, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Actually, she's not. The new voice came from the warehouse entrance, where a woman in an FBI jacket stood with a team of federal agents, weapons drawn and trained on the Torino men. FBI, everyone on the ground now. Chaos erupted. Anthony's men spun toward the new threat, giving Matthias the opening he needed. He dove toward Helen, covering her body with his as gunfire erupted around them. But in the confusion, one of Anthony's men had a clear shot at Matthias's exposed back. The shot rang out, and Helen felt Matthias jerk against her, felt something warm and wet soaking through his shirt. Matthias! She screamed as he collapsed, his steel-grey eyes going unfocused. I'm okay, he whispered, but blood was spreading across his chest, and his face was getting pale. I'm okay, Bambina mia. No, you're not, she said fiercely, pressing her hands against the wound to stop the bleeding. You don't get to leave me now, not when we just found each other. Around them, the FBI was rounding up the surviving Torino men, but Helen's world had narrowed to just the man bleeding in her arms. The roses, he whispered, his voice getting weaker. Every Tuesday. Did you know? They were from me. I hoped, she admitted, tears streaming down her face. I hoped they were from someone who saw me the way you see me. Ti amo, he whispered in Italian. Ti amo, stella mia. I love you, my star. Ti amo anch'io, she replied in the same language, watching his eyes widen with surprise and wonder even as they began to close. But you have to stay with me, you have to fight. The last thing she heard before the paramedics took him away was his voice, barely a whisper. For you, I'll fight forever. As the ambulance raced through the streets of New York, sirens wailing, Helen held his hand and made her own promise. If he survived this, she would never let him doubt again that he deserved love, happiness, and a future free from the ghosts of the past. But first he had to survive. 18 hours. That's how long Helen sat in the hospital waiting room, still wearing her blood-stained clothes, refusing to leave, even though the doctors had assured her multiple times that Matthias was in stable condition. The bullet had missed his heart by inches, but he'd lost a lot of blood. Around her, the waiting room filled with an unlikely collection of people. Alessandro and the other Romano men maintained a respectful vigil near the windows. Victoria sat across from her, having insisted on staying despite being medically cleared hours ago. Most surprising of all, FBI agent Sarah Martinez, no relation despite the shared name, had remained to take statements and, Helen suspected, to ensure she was all right. Mrs. Romano? Helen looked up to find a doctor in surgical scrubs approaching. We're not married, she said quickly. But you are Helen Martinez. When she nodded, he smiled. He's been asking for you. Quite insistently, actually. He's awake and stable if you'd like to see him. The private room was filled with flowers, dozens of white roses that made Helen's heart ache with their familiarity. Matthias was propped up in bed, pale but alert, his steel-grey eyes tracking her movement the moment she stepped through the door. You stayed, he said, his voice rough but strong. Of course I stayed, she replied, taking the chair beside his bed. Did you think I was going to abandon you in a hospital? I thought you might have had time to think about what being with me really means. The danger, the violence, the fact that people will always be trying to hurt you to get to me. Helen was quiet for a long moment, studying his face, the strong jaw, the aristocratic nose, the eyes that had seen too much pain but still held such capacity for love. Do you remember what you told me about your sister? She asked finally. Which part? That she was everything good in your world. He nodded, clearly not understanding where she was going with this. Last night, when I thought I was going to lose you, she continued, I realized something. You've become everything good in my world, not because you're rich or powerful or dangerous, but because you see me, really see me, in a way no one ever has. Helen, I'm not finished, she said gently. I also realized that I'm not the same person I was yesterday. The woman who served coffee and pressed roses in cookbooks. She was living half a life, always watching other people live their dreams instead of creating her own. She stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the city where her entire world had changed. I spoke to Agent Martinez this morning, she said. The Torino family is finished. Between the recordings and the evidence they've been gathering, there won't be any more threats from that direction. Victoria is safe, and she's actually not as terrible as I thought. Scared and lonely, but not terrible. What are you saying? She turned to face him, her decision crystallizing as she met his gaze. "I'm saying that I love you, Matthias Romano. Not despite your world, but including it. I want to learn everything about your business, the legitimate side and the complicated side. I want to understand how to be your partner in all of it, not just the pretty face you keep safe in the background." His eyes widened. "You want to be part of the family business?" "I want to be part of your life," she corrected. "All of it. The charity foundations, the real estate development, the hotel chains, and yes, the parts that require making hard decisions to protect people you care about. You could get hurt, you could be killed. I could also get hit by a bus tomorrow," she pointed out. "Life doesn't come with guarantees, Matthias, but I'd rather live dangerously with you than safely without you." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise after the longest night. "Marry me," he said suddenly. "What? Marry me?" he repeated, struggling to sit up straighter despite his injury. "Not because it's expected or strategic or good for business, but because I can't imagine spending another day of my life without you." "You're proposing from a hospital bed?" "I'm proposing from wherever I am when I can't wait another second to call you mine," he said seriously. "Stella Mia, will you marry me?" The Italian endearment, my star, combined with the vulnerability in his voice, broke down her last defense. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, I'll marry you." The kiss that followed was interrupted by a knock on the door. Alessandro entered, followed by Victoria and Agent Martinez. "Sorry to interrupt," Victoria said, though she was smiling, "but there are some things we need to discuss." Over the next hour, they worked out details that would reshape both their lives. The FBI investigation was essentially closed, with the Romano family's cooperation ensuring no charges would be filed against legitimate business operations. Victoria revealed that she had never wanted the arranged marriage anyway. She was in love with someone else, a tech entrepreneur her family had forbidden her to see. "This actually works out perfectly for everyone," Victoria said pragmatically. "You two get your love story, I get my freedom, and our families maintain their alliance through business partnerships instead of marriage." "What about your father?" Matthias asked. "Daddy will adjust," Victoria replied with confidence, "especially when I point out that having Helen as an ally gives us access to federal law enforcement contacts and community connections the family has never had before." Agent Martinez cleared her throat. "Speaking of which, I have a proposition for you, Ms. Martinez." "Oh?" "The Bureau is always looking for consultants who understand both legitimate business and alternative family structures. Someone who could help us distinguish between actual criminal activity and cultural misunderstandings. The pay is excellent, and it would give you credentials that would be useful in your new position." Helen looked at Matthias, who nodded encouragingly. "What kind of position?" she asked. "Head of Community Relations for Romano Enterprises," Alessandro said, speaking up for the first time. "It's a new position the Don wants to create. Someone to oversee charitable activities, community partnerships, and public relations." "Don?" Helen looked confused. "That would be you in about 6 months," Alessandro explained to Matthias. "Your father announced his retirement this morning. He said watching his son nearly die made him realize it was time to let the next generation take over." Matthias looked stunned. "He's stepping down, effective immediately, which means you'll be taking over as head of the family, just as the business transitions to completely legitimate operations." "We'll be taking over," Matthias corrected, reaching for Helen's hand. "Partners in everything." As the afternoon sun streamed through the hospital window, Helen realized that her life had become something she never could have imagined. In less than a week, she'd gone from serving coffee to planning a future as the wife of one of New York's most powerful men. But more than that, she'd discovered that love really could transform everything, turning enemies into allies, fear into courage, and two broken people into something stronger together than they'd ever been apart. "When do you want to get married?" she asked. "Tomorrow," Matthias replied immediately. "Be serious." "I am serious. I've waited 20 years to feel this happy. I don't want to wait another day to make you my wife." Looking into his steel-grey eyes, seeing the love and determination there, Helen realized that nothing about their love story had been conventional so far. Why start now? 5 years later, Helen Romano stood in the garden of their estate in the Hamptons, watching her husband teach their 3-year-old daughter Isabella to plant white roses. The little girl, with her father's steel-grey eyes and her mother's bright smile, was more interested in making mud pies than actual gardening, but Matthias patiently guided her small hands anyway. "Mama!" Isabella called out in her mixture of English and Italian. "Look, pretty flowers like Zia Victoria." Victoria had become not just a friend, but a sister, serving as maid of honor at their wedding and godmother to their daughter. She was happily married to her tech billionaire, running a successful charity foundation, and visiting every few months with stories that made their own dramatic love story seem almost ordinary. "Beautiful Principessa," Helen called back, using the endearment that never failed to make their daughter giggle. The transformation in their lives had been remarkable. Romano Enterprises was now completely legitimate. Luxury hotels, real estate development and import-export businesses that employed hundreds of people. Helen's work as head of community relations had earned her recognition from the mayor's office and invitations to speak at business schools about ethical leadership transitions. But the most amazing transformation was in Matthias himself. The man who had once believed he didn't deserve beautiful things now worked tirelessly to create beauty wherever he went. The Romano Foundation funded children's hospitals, educational programs, and community centers throughout the city, and every Tuesday morning, without fail, he still left a white rose on Helen's pillow before she woke up. "Mrs. Romano," came Alessandro's voice from the terrace, "your 3 o'clock appointment is here." "Send them to my office," she replied. "I'll be right there." Her home office overlooked the garden, allowing her to work while keeping an eye on her family. Today's meeting was with a group of young women from the city, daughters of families involved in various traditional businesses who wanted guidance on transitioning to legitimate careers. It had become her specialty, helping the next generation break cycles while honoring their family loyalties. Some wanted to become lawyers, others business executives, and a few, like herself, wanted to bridge both worlds by creating positive change from within. As she watched the young women leave an hour later, armed with college application information, internship connections, and most importantly, hope, Helen reflected on how far she'd come from the waitress who once pressed white roses in a cookbook. "Deep thoughts?" Matthias appeared in her doorway, their daughter balanced on his hip despite his expensive suit. "Just thinking about choices," she said, standing to kiss him hello. "How different our lives would have been if you hadn't asked me about Marcus that night." "No," he said seriously, shifting Isabella so he could frame Helen's face with his free hand. "You were always going to be mine, amore mio. Maybe it would have taken longer, maybe the path would have been different, but some things are just destined. Even with everything we've been through, the danger, the family histories, the FBI investigations, especially because of all that," he said, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that still made her heart race after 5 years. "Easy love stories are for other people. We got the kind of love that changes everything." As evening fell over their garden, they sat together on the terrace while Isabella played with her toys nearby. The little girl had no idea that her parents had once lived in different worlds, that their love story had begun with violence and secrets and pain. To her, they were simply Mama and Papa, who loved each other and her with the kind of fierce devotion that made her feel safe enough to explore every corner of their world. "Ti amo, Stella mia," Matthias murmured against Helen's hair as they watched their daughter create elaborate stories for her dolls. "Ti amo anch'io," she replied in the Italian she now spoke fluently. "Forever, forever," he agreed. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Helen thought about the question that had started it all. "Tell me he's not yours." It had been asked out of jealousy and desperation, but it had led them to a love that had transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone around them. Sometimes, she reflected, the most beautiful love stories begin with the most dangerous questions. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to answer honestly, you might just discover that the person you think you can never have is actually the person you were always meant to find. In the distance, church bells chimed the hour,